abroad. We are, we are privileged to have all those here who have been able to take out time to join us today. We at Primus are delighted to welcome you to the virtual book launch of our new title, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age by Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty. With climate change and global warming affecting us at an alarming rate, the release of this book is particularly fitting in today's day and age, as it discusses how humankind has become a fearsome geophysical force, capable of changing the climate system of the planet as a whole. This has impacted the planet to an extent that we have ushered in a whole new epoch, the Anthropocene, a category that is still debated by scientists and humanist scholars. However, as Professor Chakrabarty notes, whether or not the category of Anthropocene is formalized, there is enough scientific evidence to show that we have moved beyond the category of the global and into the planetary. This volume, thus, hopes to confront us with the changed nature of human agency and our unprecedented impact on the planet we live on. Before we move on to the main event, please allow me to introduce this evening's discussants, beginning with our esteemed author. Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty is Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History, South Asian Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. He specializes in the fields of modern South Asian history and historiography, subaltern indigenous and minority histories, decolonization, and environmental history and climate change. In 2014, he was awarded the Toynbee Foundation Prize for being a distinguished practitioner of global history. His other publications include the thought-provoking Provincializing Europe, Postcolonial Thought and Historical Difference, The Calling of History, Sir Jadunath Sarkar and His Empire of Truth, and The Crises of Civilization, Exploring Global and Planetary Histories. Our chair for this evening is Dr. Jairam Ramesh, Member of Parliament and Chairman of Parliament's Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment, Forests and Climate Change. He has been a Union Minister of India and has held several key portfolios, such as Environment and Forests, Rural Development, and Drinking Water and Sanitation. He is the author of several well-known books and biographies, such as Green Signals, Ecology, Growth and Democracy in India. His latest work, The Light of Asia, the poem that defined the Buddha, has recently been published with a foreword by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. We also have four eminent panelists with us this evening. Our first speaker, Professor Shahid Amin, taught at the Department of History at Delhi University before retiring in 2015. A founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective, Professor Amin is also the author of Event, Metaphor, Memory, Chauri Chaura, 1922 to 1992, which was awarded the Kumaraswamy Prize by the South Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies. He has also edited, along with Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, Subaltern Studies Volume 9, Writings on South Asian History and Society. Our next speaker, Professor Tanika Sarkar, was Professor and Chair of Modern History before she retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has edited and co-edited several volumes on caste, community, and gender in colonial India, such as Hindu Wife, Hindu Nation, Community, Religion, and Cultural Nationalism, and has also published several monographs on political nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. A collection of her essays on Hindu nationalism are due to be released at the end of this year. We at Primus have also had the pleasure of publishing her co-edited volume, Christianity in Indian History, Issues of Culture, Power, and Knowledge. Our third speaker, Professor Rohan D'Souza, is Professor of the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies, Kyoto University. He has previously taught environmental history at the Center for the Study of Science Policy at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor D'Souza has authored several volumes relating to environmental history and climate change, including Drowned and Dammed, Colonial Capitalism and Flood Control in Eastern India, as well as a co-edited volume published by Primus titled Commonwealth Forestry and Environmental History, Empire Forests and Colonial Environments in Africa, the Caribbean, South Asia, and New Zealand. Our final speaker this evening, Professor Rita Brara, is presently visiting fellow at the Rachel Carson Center for the Study of Environment and Society in Munich, and a research fellow affiliated with the Institute of Economic Growth, New Delhi. Formerly professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Delhi, She has also been a visiting professor at Ashoka University. Professor Brara is the author of Shifting Landscapes, The Making and Unmaking of the Village Commons in India, and has edited and contributed to several other volumes. Her research focuses on social constructions of the natural environment and climate change, as well as gender, kinship, and visual culture. Now, after our esteemed panelists have said a few words, we will be opening the floor to questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question for Professor Chakrabarty, Dr. Ramesh, or the four discussants, please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A box below, and please mention who your question is directed to. Now, without any further ado, I request our chair today, Dr. Jairam Ramesh, to release the volume and virtually present it to Professor Chakrabarty.
Well, I'll take you through the release. As per your instructions, there's a ribbon, the book is covered. I'm now cutting the ribbon, and the book is so neatly packaged. Of course, it's beautifully produced, I must say. So here's the book which we are discussing today, and let me congratulate.
Thank you.
For a really an outstanding book, and let me not forget to congratulate Mr. Verma for an excellently produced book. The pleasure of holding a book, maybe 60% is the substance, the content, and 40% is the production. And absolutely top-class production. Wonderful to hold, wonderful to read. I'm not going to take long because we're going to have Professor Chakrabarty tell us about the book, and I don't want to preempt him, but I want to begin by saying that I'm really delighted and privileged to be in the midst of four very distinguished academics, distinguished scholars. I'm from an entirely different world, but have pretensions to the world of scholarship and academics. And it is with great interest that I read Professor Chakrabarty's latest book. And it's only last evening I solved the mystery of why he wrote such a profoundly well-informed book, uh, quite far removed from mainstream history. I always thought of Professor Chakrabarty as a historian, and it's only last evening I was given to understand that he originally came from a background in physics and geology. And anyone who reads this book will get a sense that here is a historian who is very well conversant with the scientific literature and is able to explain that scientific literature in a historical context. Of course, the word Anthropocene is a word that comes from the world of geology, which Professor Chakrabarty is very well acquainted with. So he's a very unusual historian. He has multiple backgrounds, and it shows in this book. And I was struck. If somebody were to ask me, how would you summarize 275 pages in one line, which I am often called upon to do in Parliament because people's attention span is very, very limited. I was struck by perhaps the fundamental point that Professor Chakrabarty makes, that the word global in globalization is different from the word global in global warming. I think, that's a very profound point, because on the one hand, we have the concept of globalization is embedded, and on the other, we have global warming, which is embedded in the world of ecology. And what Professor Chakrabarty tries to do and succeeds very well in this book is to bring together these two worlds, the worlds of economics, as exemplified by the term globalization, and ecology, as exemplified by the term global warming. And of course, he has much more to say than this very brief soundbite type of a summary that I have provided in this book. But I think this is really at the intersection of economics and ecology. And there is a third E which permeates the book, which is equity. And I think that's where the historian in Professor Chakrabarty comes out very, very forcefully, because he looks at economics, he looks at ecology, but he doesn't forget the world of equity. Equity among nations and equity within nations. I think both are very important. And as somebody who's been part of international discourse on environmental issues, this notion of equity, this notion of fairness, this notion of justice is very, very important when it comes, of course, in negotiations between nations, but it's also very important when we talk about distributional issues within nations. So I think, these three E's, economics, ecology, and equity, are something that really runs through this very, very well written book, free from the jargon that normally one associates with such books, and is written in a language which one can really understand and relate to, and his references. Quality of a book is judged not just by how it looks, but by also by its footnotes. Very often I read the footnotes much more than I read the main text. That's an old habit, and I found myself exceedingly, educated by the broad span, the knowledge that Chakravarty has drawn upon to write this book. I think it's a major contribution to the world of economics. It's a major contribution to the world of ecology. It's, of course, a major contribution to the world of history. That goes without saying. So let me stop here. We'll have Professor Chakrabarty speak about the book. We'll have a discussion amongst the four very distinguished scholars. Towards the end, perhaps I'll spend 5-6 minutes just rounding up the discussion. So over to Professor Chakrabarty.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh, for that very, very warm and kind introduction. And to Bholaji, of course, for organizing this launch. And I'm also extremely honored that my friends, Shahid and Tanika and Rita are here, and Rohan is also here, sparing time for this occasion. And thank you to everybody who is in attendance. So I want to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and Bhola, Dr. Ramesh, please, either put off, tell me that I should finish, and I'm happy to finish mid-sentence and take up things in the Q&A session. So the first thing I want to say about this book is that unlike the other books I've written, there was no model for writing this book. Because when I began my life as a historian doing labor history, and when we did labor history, there was the great and exemplary and inspiring work of E.P. Thompson in front of us, creating a model for everybody working in labor history in the world from the 1960s on. When I wrote Provincializing Europe, the post-colonial theorists were already writing. Edward Said has written a book. Ranajit Guha has brought out subaltern studies. There was Chatterjee, Shahid Amin, my friends here. We were all part of that debate. And also it was being debated by very close friends like Tanika and Sumit Sarkar in India. So while there wasn't a model of another book called Provincializing Europe, but at least it wasn't uncharted territory. When I wrote Jadunath Sarkar, there was always the figure of Ranka there, looming large. And also there were scholarly biographies of James Murray, for instance, who started the Oxford English Dictionary. So there are models for doing life income scholarship. But when I started on this project, which happened through a kind of biographical accident of a a huge fire in 2003 destroying the parts of the city of Canberra, where I did my PhD, and more importantly, destroying all the nature spots around that city that I used to love and had grown to love during my PhD years. And so I had a sense of loss, almost a sense of bereavement. And since Australia is very well endowed with environmental historians, many of whom are my friends, I knew that Australia needed cyclical fires to renew the gum trees. So I asked people, why were the fires so bad this time? Is it the drought that the country was going through? And all my friends said, this is not an ordinary drought. These are not ordinary fires. This is climate change. And I had barely heard about climate change in 2003. I'd heard about it. I didn't know much about it. And I began to read up. And when I began to read the literature, and there I go back to what Dr. Ramesh was saying, see, unlike many of my historian friends, I always had an interest in the history of the natural world. And that's partly what took me to do some science. And geology was always fascinating for me. And it kind of became of renewed interest when to Australia, because I was working on Indian history, and I'd gone to Australia for both personal and scholarly and academic reasons. But I very much missed home. And I used to curse myself by saying, why the hell am I doing Indian history? Because everything I read reminds me back of home. And why didn't I become a geologist? Because Australia is geologically fascinating. And I mean, every place is. And I thought, if I were a geologist, the world would be my book. I wouldn't feel nostalgic. I wouldn't feel homeless in the way that I did in my initial years as a historian. So I did have an interest, and they said climate change. So I began to read up. And mind you, I should also say that I'm not the only historian not to have bothered about climate change in 2000 until 2003. In the year 2000, the eminent, respectable Harvard historian, Charles Meyer, wrote an essay, probably on invitation from American Historical Review in the year 2000, saying, consigning the 20th century to history. And it has everything about the 20th century, but not a word about climate change or global warming. Or if you look at Chris Bailey's The Making of the Modern World, which came out in the early 2000s, same problem, not a word about climate change or global warming, even though global warming was actually being written about for general readers from the same time when globalization was written about, which is the early 1990s. Because IPCC had been set up in 1988, so scientists were writing books explaining what global warming was. But we were not reading them. Whereas if you read Chris Bailey's, the posthumously published second volume to The Making of the Modern World, you will find that there is a chapter on the Anthropocene and climate change. So what happened in between is that the fourth report of the IPCC came out, and the scientists upped their ante to make themselves heard. I saw a relatively rich country like Australia becoming absolutely scared that their country would become unlivable. There was a water scarcity, there was water rationing everywhere. And Australians were talking about maybe the world will be divided between water importing and water exporting societies. I mean, as it is, the world actually is divided between such societies through the export of meat, the export of cotton goods. I mean, we would end up exporting a lot of water, even from places where that shouldn't be exporting water. But what struck me in reading this literature, what I was blown away by, was the proposition that the scientists were making that human beings, with their technology, numbers, the animals they keep, had become such a force, a geological force, that they could have the same impact as the asteroid that struck the Earth and wiped off dinosaurs, or like a huge volcanic eruption. So we have the capability to change the climate system of the whole planet. And that went so contrary. I mean, that imagination of the human was so contrary to the way we imagined human beings in writing history. And there's a long heritage from Collingwood, from actually Crochet to Collingwood. And Crochet got this at a conference in Frankfurt around 1906, where a German economist said, nature has only chronology. humans have history. I mean, and then of course, Croce and Collingwood were drawing on some Baconian kind of heritages, Vico's heritage, but up until the 18th century, the biblical history, the universal histories were actually telling histories of both natural world and the human world together. But you come to the 19th century and you get a separation of the natural sciences from the social sciences, which gets quite solidified by the end of the 19th century. And so there was a deep separation between what we call recorded history and what you might call deep history, which is a distinction made by Edward Wilson. So I was, first of all, I thought the very assumption that underpins my discipline is being challenged by these two figures of the human coming together. And that's where I started. And I wrote up my thoughts in the form of 4 theses, actually initially in Bangla, where nobody was interested. And then I came back to America, and Critical Inquiry, a journal I was associated with, the editor said to me, "We are short of articles. Have you got something?" So I wrote it up and expanded it. And that launched the book, because what happened was the moment I published this article, it got translated in many languages. Actually, the first Indian language to translate was Malayalam. And I was immediately, it was kind of, it's still, I think, one of the most downloaded articles in the history of that journal. But I got a lot of pushback from friends on the left saying, it's all about capitalism, it's whatever, it's all about the economy. And that launched the book, because I was then arguing back with these people with whom I half agreed and half not agree. So in a way, and I found myself in uncharted territories, because I knew that I could not address this question as a scientist, though I was reading the scientists. And in the book, I talk about the 4 questions that Kant talks about in his Introduction to Logic, where he says, if you want to know what is happening, then you go to science. If you want to know what should be done, then you go to politicians, policy people, activists, and others. If you want to know what do you expect, how to prepare yourself, you go to aesthetics, you go to religion. But he said all these questions eventually fold themselves into a final question: what is the human being? So on the one hand, beginning with those questions, the collapse of natural and human history, and how it came about and why the figure of the human had doubled, led me to the distinction that Dr. Ramesh mentioned, which is to say that the globe of globalization is not the same as the globe of global warming, which eventually in my language became the distinction between one I called the globe, the other one I called the planet. And I was actually saying that because Earth system scientists are also human beings, so even when they construct an object, it's a constructed object, nobody bumps into the Earth system. So even when a constructor object heuristically called the Earth system, Earth as a system, they respond to their own construction with emotions. They respond with concern. They come back and tell politicians, look, something is going on, we must do something, which is what James Hansen did in 1988. So they actually also respond as citizens, as human beings. And because the whole question of whether something is dangerous for human civilization, whether something should be done is ethical in terms of equity, as Dr. Ramesh was saying, these are not scientific questions. These are questions of value. These are questions of politics. These are questions of the human sciences. So I actually realized that one could read these geological historians, evolutionary biologists as fellow historians, working with different archives, different methods, different ways of debating, but one could read them as fellow historians. And that's why I began to read them as fellow historians. And the other a point about making the globe planet distinction was that, even if the Anthropocene were to be formalized by geologists, they call it a geological epoch. An epoch is the smallest unit of periodization on a geological timescale. But even an epoch usually lasts, Holocene would be very short if they change it. Usually an epoch can last for millions of years, tens of millions of years, even the shortest division. And actually, if we do end up getting the sixth great extinction of life beginning now, and because of what humans are doing, then my geologist friend were telling me that we would have to upgrade the period label from an epoch to an era. We'd have to call it the Anthropozoic era, not the Anthropocene epoch. But my realization was that even if it were to be an epoch, which is the shortest period, it could be a few million years, and the Anthropocene might be much, much longer than human history. And therefore, the Anthropocene could not be a way of periodizing human history. But what I argue in the book is that what has happened in the last 10 years, so as climate change, global warming, acidification of the seas, sea levels rising, species extinction, and the pandemic, of course, because of destruction of forests, as these things have become part of everyday news, educated people are more aware today of what you might call the geobiological history of the planet in uneven degrees than they were when Charles Meyer wrote his article consigning the 20th century to history in 2000. And therefore, I thought, I begin the book by saying this, that if Hegel were around today, and Hegel was always plotting history of consciousness, so that the French Revolution, for him, the very slogans, liberty, equality, fraternity, the very slogans for him suggested the incipient arrival of a new consciousness. And I said, our good old friend and enemy Hegel would have said that, look, it's no longer just the era of globalization. Human consciousness is changing. There's something being added from deep history to human awareness. And therefore, I say we're on the cusp of the global and the planetary age. And that's kind of what I say to my historian friends. But this also signals a tremendous predicament for human aspirations to modernize, to live better, to live with more resources, to consume more, to have better health. And the pandemic is one illustration of that predicament. And the other question I had in mind in writing this book, because I was reading Hannah Arendt as much as I was reading Marx and others in writing this book. And I was very struck that when Hannah Arendt wrote the book on the human condition, which came out in 1958, she wrote it in the shadow of the Soviet Sputnik having gone up. And that for her was a moment of both optimism tinged with a certain kind of sadness. Because on the one hand, she says, at the end of the commenting on the Sputnik, she says, the human species has now ensured its survival. They can go somewhere else and the species will survive. But at the cost of what she said was alienation. They're earthlings after all. And so we'll suffer earth alienation. And I kept asking myself, how would she update the book if she were to write in the shadow of global warming? Wouldn't she say that the human condition has changed from the 1950s, and even the kind of qualified optimism that she was expressing probably was no longer in order in the same form? So the book eventually does two things, but one is to talk about how to think about the present period of human history. The other one is how to think about the human condition and how to mark a change in the human condition from, let's say, Hannah Arendt's time. But as I said, and I'll end by saying this, in the very beginning, as I said, that this was a book for which there was no path. It was like the distinction that Heidegger would often make between theory and thinking. I mean, if you're a theorist, then you want to tie up all loose ends. You're like a Hegel or a Kant, you're a system builder, or a Marx. But if you're a thinker, Heidegger would often say, a thinker lives on the margin of error, because you've gone into a jungle with an axe and you're trying to cut your own path through it. And there, the criticisms were extremely helpful, because even when I didn't agree with my critics, it put pressure on my own thought. I had to clarify my thought to myself. And that became a kind of recursive exercise, which took the form of many lectures from which I did. I gave the Tanner lectures, from which I kept a little bit in this book, because also I was learning. The first mistake I made in the 4th thesis essay was that I separated geology and biology too much. I actually say humans have always had biological agency, but this geological agency is new. And then, of course, as I read on, I realized that life itself has a geological agency. And that this planet is distinguished by a connection between geology and biology. The planet has more minerals because of the process of oxidation. We have more oxygen because we have life. And my final point was to say that the global and the planet are two different perspectival points. They're not just periodizing devices. They also show the human being in two different lights. The global is a story of which humans are right at the center. You can't tell the story of globalization without the story of empires, colonialism, Europeans taking other people's lands, deep sea vessels being made by them, trade, capitalism, all that. And the center of, and humans are at the center of that story. But the planet is something that makes, when we are faced with planet's fury, we depend on the planet, but the planet doesn't look back at us in the way that we often assumed it does. And the best example of that, which I give, and which I recently realized in rereading Tagore's Bangla book called Introduction to the Universe, even Tagore was aware of to some degree, that the atmosphere has oxygen at a level where it doesn't ever go up so much that the forests burn up. And it doesn't ever go down so low that oxygen breathing animals choke to death. And because oxygen is a highly promiscuous reactive gas, this atmosphere has to be constantly supplied with fresh oxygen. And you know who does that? It's the phytoplanktons, it's the fungi, it's the bacteria, it's sometimes plants and trees, forms of life that we often think of as inferior forms of life. They keep this atmosphere going. And when you read Earth System Scientists, you're just amazed to read this atmosphere, which they call the modern atmosphere of the planet, has been sustained by these creatures for 375 million years, long, long before they were humans. So humans were not what the planet was looking at in order to create this atmosphere. Even if humans hadn't come around, this atmosphere would be there. So I said the planet decenters humans in our own thinking. The humans come so late in the story of biology and geology that you can't make humans central to the story of geology and biology. And I'll give you one example at very end and finish. So when the big Australian fires broke out in 2019-20, Australian government took a decision to kill 20,000 feral camels. And why did they want to kill the camels? Because the camels were competing with a group of humans for water. So faced with the fires, I would say, reduced both humans and the camels to surviving creatures. And you know that you're not political, you're not Zune political, you're not Aristotelian human being. If as humans, you're only trying to survive, because then you are, in the biblical sense, just one creature amongst many. And that's the other point that I try to make in terms of, I would just want to add a fourth E to the three E's that Dr. Ramesh mentioned, which is ethics. So in some ways, I also try to develop some ethical read the human conditions. I would say there are those four E's perhaps in the book. If one has to describe them, you describe the book in terms of these E's. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty. I now invite Professor Shahid Amin to say a few words.
Uh, I'll address Dipesh in a certain way. Dipesh, I've listened to you since 1976 over issues which you have flagged, and I've always been struck. That's the wrong word. Bowled over is also the wrong word because it brings cricket, which is a recent thing, into our discussion. By the wide-reaching, the daring originality, and a way of putting it across. That's why, unlike most of us, I've seen you lecture without any notes, not just in the classroom, but in lectures. So, this is something that is so wonderful in you and so original in some ways among lapsed historians or current historians that, I really admire, and I feel that I'm lucky to have, been seen your work change over all these years. So let me begin by formally thanking you, which is unfair on the part of a friend in public. Now, as you could imagine, this was a very difficult book for somebody like me to read through and fully grasp. Because it takes us, especially somebody like me who works on a particular kind of history, into areas and a kind of guff, mixing of the planetary and the global, and so many, some beautiful imageries. And one learns as one goes along, and with surprise, I love this idea that you throw towards the end of Biopedia, right? The fact that we, in effect, as humans are in love, in fact, with nature in a way which we think purely in aesthetic terms, going back to the same lodge on a mountain, or walking through the same forest, which Oxford philosophers would walk through long walks and think. So, the relationship between humans and nature and the world, lots of people have talked about, but you bring such a strong dose is a wrong word, such a rich mixture of purely scientific, which we are not capable of grasping as social scientists, to bear on issues which, in their limited impact, which is global warming, are the burning, concern of today. So in a way, Ryan, only looking at global warming, in the past and prospectively, right? England and America and India and China, you are saying, well, these are important things, but let's look in planetary terms. Now, and they are just wonderful things for anybody who reads this book. And you don't have to fully get all the geology and everything that Dipesh, the wide ranging, like Jairam as a kind of a old style historian, I go straight for footnotes, and that's why I think in the old style, when you nodded, Harvard system, footnoting and talking in terms of this. So I think one should not say as a friend, but somebody who's unfamiliar with most of these things. I really want to express my wonder and my gratefulness at the kind of stuff that you have packed with Vermaji's and between these two covers. So now, as they say, now coming to, in the Indian sense, to some quibbles, not quibbles, but read through was an interesting way in which, in the beginning you say, there has been criticism of the fourth thesis for me letting capitalism off very lightly. And you keep engaging with that criticism. Don't just lay it aside, but you keep bringing it back, like, so that at some times your prose shows that kind of slight annoyance, like as in the discussion of Catherine Morrison's civilization, and I guess at the back of that is an idea of agency of humans, of action. Ethics, you said, implicitly coming back to the issue of what kind of politics in the broad sense of the term should even begin, at what place and what manner of thinking should a politics now emerge, which is a new kind of politics. You're not giving up the term politics, because in your understanding of politics, it is also tied with the issue of ethics. So you are, in my reading, you are in a sense struggling to give us, who are outsider to the comprehensive view that you have, suggesting that, look, there is an ethics, there is a politics, but of course, you don't lay it out. You keep on talking about how that politics cannot be entirely human-centered to the extent of world-centered. But I see that is something that is there in your book, and which should, if I may say so, should be there in all books which deal at all with humans. Now, here the play is between the human, the world, and the planetary. But I see that as something that at the end of it, the day, is what keeps us going, the idea of ethics, rather than just knowledge. So that's my reading, and I looked at it all through, from your first reference to being, having let capitalism off. You keep, in a way, returning, because in some ways it takes us back to the old style idea of politics. So that's, I found this very interesting and very important, I think. The second thing which I took to this book, and I take back from it in terms of my own practice, because frankly, as academics, this is not knowledge. We also are practitioners in our own ways. So, Dipesh, I just want to share with you just 4 or 5 minutes a concern that I've had for some time. You talk about the global, and the globalization is not the global of the global warming. And the other thing that resonates with me is the idea of global history, without the kind of density, in the good sense of the term, that the term global has in your understanding. And there's been a demand, in a way, the demand, it goes back to, in a way, the West and Europe. It's not simply a new idea. In effect, there has been an argument and propagation that all history, in effect, should be global history. Some of these histories are absolutely fantastic. The global history of cotton, for instance, by Sven Beckert, Europe, that in a sense, it takes away from any understanding of the past of ordinary humans in the non-Europe in terms other than a term of global history, where you compared, cotton consumption in India with China and Bolivia and so on and so forth. So I was just wondering that as a old timer historian and as a fellow now left to a fellow gang of four of the old school, how do you what place in your understanding, because you've also been following these, would a connected history be an idea? Or in other words, is there a place for a Natalie Davis or a Carlo Ginzburg, where which in a way, in a world not just of planetary, but of the global, as in the term global history? So that's, I know this is a very parochial viewpoint from which I speak, but in some ways, Dipesh, parochialism is what I've got. Thank you very much, Dipesh, for the book and for this fantastic exposition. Thank you, Dipesh.
Thank you. Thank you, Shahid.
Thank you so much, Professor Amin. I now request our next speaker, Professor Tanika Sarkar, to address the viewers here today.
Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Mr. Verma, for bringing out this Indian edition of this major book. There are fortunately several distinguished scholars here to discuss the book with the competence that it deserves. But I do hope that Dipesh Chakrabarty also wrote this book to educate laypersons and novices like me. And perhaps I can be something of a sounding board in that respect. I think Dipesh has always broken his own mold as he went on writing his books. So this book is no surprise. What is surprising, however, is the enormous scope of this book, range that he covers, and that pushes us towards enlarging our own horizons as much as we can. He covers deep histories of humans and planet Earth, human and what he calls unhuman planetary time, the time of the Anthropocene. All this and much more he explains and connects with crystalline clarity, processing them through rich philosophical and historiographical reflections. It's a passionate plea for understanding our unique planet, which alone shelters and nurtures multiple species. It's also an urgent call for, as he calls it, decentering the human as the pivotal point of planetary existence. Instead, he powerfully argues for a recognition of our critical dependence on non-humans and on the Earth. And this, interestingly, puts him somewhat at odds with the humanist scholarship to which he otherwise belongs. He makes very interesting use of Heidegger from time to time. And though he doesn't explicitly mention Heidegger's notion of being into which humans are thrown and with which humans must make their terms, I think that constitutes an important horizon for his kind of thinking. Perhaps a brief engagement with Heidegger's interlocutors could have added something more to this. On one hand, early Sartre, whose solipsistic stress on pure self-consciousness as the beginning and end of meaning, or Cassirer's reassertion that human rules must rule nature, which only partly resembles the extreme humanocentrism that Chakrabarty has problematized. Levinas, on the other hand, makes a strong argument for donating ethical priority to the other, which could perhaps extend to the recognition of non-humans as well. Chakrabarty argues that so far poets and philosophers alone have articulated an affinity with an immersion in nature, as also early religions which worshipped its mysteries with awe and wonder. And I found his concluding section on Tagore and Heidegger very, very interesting, because unlike the early religions, they do not regard nature with awe and terror, but only with wonder and, a kind of wonder and romanticism. And there's a certain humanocentrism that he underlines, which undergirds even their epiphanic affinity with nature. As he points out very forcefully, the anthropocentric of life sees nature as a reservoir of usable resources to serve human needs, real and manufactured. And this came home to me very forcefully as I once traveled through Meghalaya and saw huge chunks of Himalayan mountains being gouged out. For what? To make even, sort of endless tourist lodges for the super rich. Like Dr. Faustus in Marlowe's famous play, it seems that Dr. Faustus sold his soul to the devil just to procure grapes in winter. It seems that new technologies often plunder the earth to satisfy rather frivolous needs, not important needs. But Chakrabarty never denounces science per se. Our understanding of the planet itself would have been impossible without it. And the gigantic expansion of the technosphere, as he explains, is also crucial for human survival and welfare, even though it carries enormously destructive potential. And I think he proceeds through a series of paradoxes, which in some ways perhaps remain insuperable. He recounts the historiographical and political resistances that inhibit our envisioning of different species in the singular. This comes out of what he calls the divergence between lumpers and splitters. Those whose passion for human justice, and he's very clear on that, sharpens divisions among humans, among species, and those who have begun to see human and non-human species at a fundamental level as one with the planet, as one with the planet. I was wondering if it is at all tenable to develop an intellectual and political practice where both can be retained on separate planes, both can be practiced together. And that brings us to the endless debate on capitalism and the Anthropocene. I think Chakrabarty makes no bones about the fact that capitalism, post-industrial capitalism, is indeed fast-forwarding global warming by many, many centuries. The debate on capitalism's culpability in the book actually nests two separate discussions, one about Western imperialism, which has exploited the earth along with poorer nations for several centuries. And that's, as he shows, is a well-rehearsed debate. The other, I think, has not been adequately addressed by many scholars. It's about the poor among poorer nations. The first debate revolves around the vexed problem of environmental nationalism versus planetary health. Should poorer nations be asked to curtail their emission at all, or should they be allowed a catching up time because Western nations are still responsible for the bulk of greenhouse gas emissions? Chakrabarty is very sensitive when he evokes the post-colonial ethical visions of a Nehru or a Nasser who hope to create plenty for many and achieve parity with Western powers, but even their project led to massive, uncontrolled, thoughtless manipulation of rivers, land, forests, not to speak of gigantic displacements of subaltern people. At the same time, as he once again shows, the same technologies created a bit of a comfort zone for the most deprived, like ACs or mobile phones for manual workers. On the one hand, they are necessary, even for the poorest of the poor, but they simultaneously push up unlimited production of consumer non-durables and thereby stockpile non-biodegradable waste. So Chakrabarty describes the conundrum, the contradictory pulls, with equal sensitivity to both aspects, which befits the labor historian in him, as well as the concerned environmentalist. I agree with him that capitalism is responsible, critically responsible. It may not, however, sum up the entire problem of climate change, because its critics have also celebrated man's mastery over nature and have identified science with extraction and manipulation of earthly resources. Nor do non-capitalist or anti-capitalist states offer a better environmental record so far. So when many argue that there's no saving the planet without a root and branch eradication of capitalism first, I wonder how much of that is possible within a how much of that is possible doable in the foreseeable future when we are running out of time so very quickly. On the other hand, how much is possible? How much recuperation is possible within a capitalist framework? Can green capitalism, for example, offer a viable alternative? And I think Chakrabarty could have said something more about its prospects. Also about the effects of nuclear arms stockpiling, nuclear power, and nuclear waste. Finally, is it at all possible to reverse or stall planetary damages significantly? If so, then how much and within what time scale? If it is not ultimately reversible, in that case, are the effects to preserve the earth merely buying time for the next few generations, or maybe next many generations, but it's not an eventual resolution? A key theme for him is how does the new category planet re-inflect conventional epistemology and ontology? What does it do to our sense of human global historical time? Because historical time, as he shows, is inevitably distended across past, present, and future. And what happens to the practice of history once our sense of past loses its anchorage in the future? And I'd ask him how specifically may our long-standing and absorbing historical concerns be modified in this light? And I have another rather naive question. Do we really decenter the human when we realize our dependence on other species? When we realize about, when we have a fuller knowledge about the Anthropocene? Or do we re-emphasize the centrality of human survival on a new register? In other words, this very necessary new awareness of our responsibility for the planet, isn't it also coming out of somewhat instrumentalist and opportunistic humanocentric approach? Isn't that the driving force ultimately? There's a very interesting historiographical survey of environmental dimensions among schools of history writing. And part of this is autobiographical, which adds to the interest. A long while back, I had been extremely impressed with Mark Bloch's The Historian's Craft, where the historian argued that while geology too goes through changes, history proper begins only when humans make their appearance in the world. And Chakrabarty repeatedly challenges this from many angles, this kind of notion. I thought, though, that he all too rather briefly mentions the Annals school, which did intercut the geological with the human. And a spate of very exciting new histories of forests, animals, rivers, and oceans had started appearing. And I'd like to know what he thinks of them. The architecture of the book is intriguing. It resembles a mansion with many rooms, but to cross to the next room or to the next step in the argument or the narrative, we have to take sometimes a circuitous route, and meet with opinions on the way, maybe with far too many of them. We do come out of the encounters very much enriched, but we may lose our way or our sense of direction quite often in the process. But these are very, very minor quibbles. The book has enormously, amazingly enlarged our horizon of thinking. And thank you, Dipesh, for that.
Thank you, Munia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarkar. I now request Professor Rohan D'Souza to say a few words.
Okay, I'm audible, I guess. Okay, thank you. I should begin with expressing my gratitude for being invited to be on this panel. I've been reading Professor Chakrabarty for many years, and so it's an interesting occasion for me to sort of directly convey my thoughts on his book. I should start by saying this book is going to make me a victim. And I have to speak as a victim in two voices. One, I must have a sense of humor. And secondly, I'm going to get the argument across in a very simplified manner, yeah, which is, and what can be worse than actually use PowerPoint, which I'm going to do in a short while. Okay, sense of humor is something of this sort. 10 minutes, you cannot completely grasp this very rich and important book. And I'm reminded of an anecdote. Apparently, Woody Allen, playwright, actor, thinker, so on and so forth, he once went for, he claimed he had gone for a speed reading class in which he read War and Peace in 45 minutes. And at the end of it, he said it was about Russia. You know, so that's the kind of feeling that I'm getting right now, discussing this really rich book in 10 minutes. All right, and so now to the simplified argument, which I'm going to express in PowerPoint, and I hope you will bear with me. So this is that shared, right? Sorry, I have to ask this. Can you see the screen? Yeah. Is the screen visible? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, we can.
We can see this.
All right.
We can see
Sorry, thank you. I couldn't get. All right. Let me basically rehearse the argument as I understand it, and of course, as a victim in the most simple, bare fashion possible. Is this moving or not? Okay, got it. So one of the book rests on a very important shift. The claim is that the Holocene epoch is over. And this is the last 11,000 years in geological time. This is also the time period in which human flourishing within Holocene variability. And one mustn't mistake the fact that within the Holocene, there's been periods of, floods, there's extreme events, there's been dry periods, there's been wet periods, there's been intensely cold periods. So it is not that we have not had variability. And so that should not be misunderstood. But that is giving way today to what we call as the radical uncertainties of the Anthropocene. I think Professor Chakrabarty has very clearly explained how the imagination thinking about the Anthropocene goes. But at the heart of it is that it's a point of no return, right? We are now entering an epoch of incredible radical uncertainties. We really cannot predict. And because we cannot predict, we cannot control. And so the kind of leeway we had in the Holocene period where, cropping cycles, cropping seasons, you had a certain ability to predict and therefore human flourishing happened. Now, there's another thing that I think is very important in the way that Professor Chakrabarty conveys the argument. And that is humans were biological agents in the Holocene epoch, right? That is to say that as biological agents, we have fouled the rivers, we have dammed them, we've denuded forests and so on and so forth. In effect, the histories that have been discussed of pollution, degradation, deforestation, those histories have understood the human as a biological agent, but not so in the epoch of in the Anthropocene. Sorry, it's not an epoch. Yeah, in the Anthropocene, where we are now no longer biological agents, but we are a geological force, which is to say that we carry the capacities that normally was given to a meteorite or huge tectonic shifts or volcanic eruptions, leading to, well, the possibility of the sixth extinction with human hands. Really, that is the core of the predicament that Professor Chakrabarty really teases out and irons out very brilliantly in this book. But what is the book really about, and why we need to be attentive to how he discusses it, is that throughout the book there is a tension between the biological agent and the geophysical force, between capitalism, which is part of the humanities and social sciences, and what comes under the sciences, a species being or bare life. Similarly, he kind of weaves these tensions between the global, which could be capitalism, our politics, our ethics, and so on and so forth, and planetary, which is how do you save, not as in the planet, but as in the conditions for all life. How do you actually act on that challenge? And lastly, of course, there's Earth and world. So you see these tensions that are really brought across in the book in many very nuanced, complex, and sophisticated ways. But at the heart of that, and this is something that I think lies really at the heart of this book, is that I think Professor Chakrabarty is trying to convey to us that it is unlikely that global politics will solve the problem of global warming. I mean, I'm putting it very crudely, which is to say, even if we sort out the challenge of capitalism, will that necessarily save the planet? Will that necessarily save life as we know it? Yeah. And I think he is very helpful in trying to tell us the complexities involved with asking that question. And so there is this tendency in the book to constantly take us back and forth between, will global politics, that is capitalism, absorb the planetary, which is science in some ways, or what is called the God species, Mark Lynn's work. God species referring to the fact that, given the crisis of global warming, human intervention is now going to be crucial. And do humans intervene as gods, setting the entire biosystem, the whole biological process, which is, gone awry or, off the bend, so to speak. It is humans now who have to behave like gods in restoring it. And in that sense, there is a kind of a dilemma here. Humans really like politics, but that politics will not be enough. We'll have to go beyond the politics in order to put the planet in a livable condition for life, our species especially, yeah, and the rest around that. So this book, and I would urge everyone to actually look at the discussion between Bruno Latour and Professor Chakrabarty in the last chapter. You can see, and I'm sorry, I'm going to be a bit unfair, but sometimes they seem to be running around in circles. They're not sure whether capitalism can actually absorb the planetary. Can science be brought to heel under a moral force? Or will the scientists really call the shots, in which case they have their own contradictions and complexities as well? So we have, in several ways, this book to me is a book that is trying to rescue politics doesn't really end up doing so, but tells us that it's a very, very important question. Yeah. For me, what really this book does is that it very clearly and meaningfully brings forward the tension between politics and planetary science. And I mean, one could argue that, do you need democracy to save the planet? Will it be a good thing if you save it? Now that you don't have democracy, but you save the planet, and so on and so forth. I mean, these kinds of questions are something that Professor Chakrabarty actually takes at different levels, philosophically, incredibly informed, and there's a lot to discuss, but of course I don't have the time. But here is where now then I bring in my own little agenda, and I will make my final point. There is collateral damage for people like me from this kind of exercise. And the collateral damage being that this is officially the end of environmental history as we know it. For many years that I've been studying, and I had looked at Professor Chakrabarty's essay in 2009, I always suspected that the consequence of an argument that unfolds in this fashion is that environmental history was about the biological human. We don't yet know how to capture not just the history, but the politics and the entire set of ingredients that go with it to understand the human as a geophysical force. Yeah, we don't know that. And I think if you were to go across Bruno Latour's and Professor Chakrabarty's discussions in the last chapter, there is this sense that they both are trying in a very sort of spirited way to try and tell us that, yes, we need politics, but we need to save the planet. But if you save the planet, can you do it with politics? And so this is a bit of the circular reflections, but of course, with a great deal of reflection that is very, very enlightening in many dimensions. So as an academic, if I was to think of opportunity here in a sort of a grim, sort of despairing but hopeful way, it does mean that we might be looking at many Anthropocene study centers and departments in different universities. And these would be able to absorb maybe environmental histories as a kind of a center or subset. But fundamentally, this book might announce that end of environmental history, which is what I really started off as an environmental historian. Yeah. So as someone who sensed it was in the offing, there's now official closure. It's over, and we might have to now rethink how we are going to put together a new kind of philosophy, a new kind of politics, a new kind of notion of time itself that will be able to get us to speak to this new predicament. Yeah, I hope I've not got the book wrong, but every victim story is important. And so thank you again for this opportunity. And I really, really am sorry that I used PowerPoint, but I didn't know how else to convey this in this most simple, crude, unsophisticated way of a book that is actually very nuanced, very sophisticated, and deserving far more than 10 minutes. All right, thank you. I'll stop the share. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor D'Souza. I now invite our final speaker, Professor Rita Brara, to address the viewers today. Professor Brara, could you turn your microphone on so we can hear you?
You hear me now?
Yes, you're audible now. Thank you.
So thank you, Primus and Mr. Verma, for inviting me to this panel. This book, if I were to put it in a nutshell, is nothing less than the future of humanity on a planetary scale. Surprisingly for me, it is written by a historian. More surprises. As I read on, the conventional generic description of a historian did not work for this writer, not in this book, on other grounds as well. This historian, when he delves into the past, digs deeper than any historian I might have come across. So it is not just about capitalism or industrialization, agriculture, or even prehistory. He goes further back, all the way back to the origins of the human species and planetary life. That planetary life was created by multicellular organisms such as algae, which oxygenated the Earth's atmosphere. The oxygen levels rose gradually in this view till it reached the bandwidth that we are now familiar with, 21%. And it was this bandwidth that was able to support multiple forms of life. This bandwidth is still important for maintaining the planet, and it's vital for life, and more importantly, it is produced and maintained by the planet's present forms of microbes and flora that go back millennia. Now, alluding to this deep past of oxygen levels, I think it was significant for Dipesh's argument in a certain way, in the sense that that is how he's able to demonstrate that what is important for humans is not just living nature, which is readily acceptable, but also parameters and elements of non-living nature, such as invisible oxygen levels of the atmosphere. Now, I'm not going to labor on his framing story about the distinction between the global and the planetary, sustainability and habitability. Some of it has already happened, and I think it's been done well. I'm, of course, have the good fortune of being the last panelist, so I can overlook some of it. But what comes through for me is this idea that, unambiguously, the global of global warming, as everyone has said, is distinguishable from the global of globalization. And it emerged from that. But what he gets across really well is that the planet in this telling is completely indifferent to the axes of human differentiation. The planet couldn't care less whether you're talking about class, gender, race, or for that matter, the distinctions of the North and South, colonizing and decolonizing. From the planet's perspective, irrespective, it is the human impact on the planet that is being registered. And this impact is now measured and collated assiduously by the Earth system scientists for laypersons and social scientists to absorb and interpret. The book's theoretical lineages are very many and kind of tentacular. Dipesh's self-stated preference is for philosophical anthropology, And this view draws him closer to the work of the anthropologist Bruno Latour, who was also concerned with the politics and ethics of climate change. And I will maybe recount just one nugget from this shared vision. Now, humans may think that they have beaten down trees and forests, but Dipesh and Latour would, from their standpoint, argue that this is a premature assumption. Whether trees have actually won or lost depends on the time scale you use to define the issue. And so it could well be argued that once humans become extinct, trees are likely to take over the planet and flourish. So, in other words, it is not forests and trees who are dependent on the human being. It is the human being who is dependent on nature and forests in this very particular way of the condition of humans to need an oxygenated atmosphere and not vice versa. The book is incredibly rich in conceptual thought, both Dipesh's own and what he brings to the table of the thinking of others. Some of these reflections are very precious for an interdisciplinary understanding of climate change, but you may relish the wit as well. So thank you, Dipesh, for this gem of a book that I think is already producing a global resonance. In a sense, I like to think that it will contribute its might to the changing climate of irresponsibility towards the planet, and maybe also provide us with glimmers of change in the climate of history and indeed historiography for our planetary age. Thank you, Dipesh.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Brara. We have some time for a brief Q&A sessions. So I'll just read out some of the questions that have been coming in during this time. So the first question is from Dr. G. Naga Sridhar for Professor Chakrabarty. Which to the present state of historiography on the environmental impact on the course of Indian history, could you identify a couple of areas where there is immense potential for further research?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I may refer to Rohan as Rohan with his permission and in friendship.
Please do.
And I think
thank you, Ali, on that. Yeah.
I think
I'm sorry, I've not been introduced to you, so
thank you. Not at all, not at all, not at all. Rohan, I think you very shrewdly picked up on something, which is this question of environmental history relationship to my project. And the climate problem was defined an environmental problem not by environmental historians. I mean, if environmental historians kept plowing the farms that they work on, they would not have stumbled on a planetary climate problem because they didn't have the equipment, the kind of measurements you need to do, boring into polar ice caps and stuff. That's not what environmental historians do. And therefore, so there is a kind of tension which I submit we don't have to think about as the end of environmental history. I mean, hopefully not victimize you or others. But I think there's a lot of intermediate level work to be done. I mean, one of the things that, and actually Dr. Ramesh might have lots to say about this. So one of the things I think about, and goes back to questions of intermediate level politics. So the rivers coming out of the Himalayas, 8 or 9 of them, service countries from Pakistan to Vietnam, right? But all the nations treat the glaciers and the rivers as national properties. So first of all, I think there's room for an environmental history, kind of almost a kind of transnational environmental history, the politics of which look forward to the creation of a transnational regional authority that looks at the health of rivers and not allow national priorities to take precedence, because those are becoming disasters. I mean, the landslides in the Himalayas, even in India that we're having, the number of dams that are being built, and then India. So I'm actually Dr. Ramesh on this. I often think that there are a lot of, I mean, even with, it's clear that the UN set up, based on the Montreal Protocol, those solved by the UN effort. But I personally feel that the UN is not the right organization to deal with planetary problems, because the UN was set up as a forum where nations would bargain for time in their national interests. Whereas the IPCC giving us urgent calendars of action. Nation states will remain. I can't see how things like the pandemic, which is part of the problem, can be handled if nations don't cede some of their authority and actually recognize that there are planetary issues. And maybe there could be pre-environment, right? If this policy, so sometimes our vision of politics, this is the history we want to write, right? So if my vision of politics is that the institutional arrangements made by nations after the Second World War are proving inadequate for the problems we are facing now in terms of planetary environment. Pandemic was one example. And the Chinese sort of caginess with the data initially, I mean, is WHO as an organization sort of a teeth? Should there be a world? There have been very interesting proposals put forward by virologists about how to handle global planetary, just in terms of management, not fundamental changes, but they all require kind of planetary organizations to be set up for specific purposes. And I often wonder whether certain sensitive parts of the world that are critical to maintain the present climate system, the Amazons, the Himalayan glaciers, or some parts of the sea, whether the question of heritage list should be extended to these parts of the world, and an authority set up, but we are not there. But on the other hand, I can imagine environmental historians or even transnational historians writing these histories that are not necessarily respectful of national priorities. And I mean, and I always find Dr. Ramesh very interesting on these questions, because when he was the environment minister, he actually made some very critical comments in the parliament, one or two of which I may have even quoted in the book on the population question. But he made remarks that made him, as far as my memory goes, unpopular with people who were actually the negotiators for India at that point, if I remember right. And I think those debates do not have to be internal to a nation, because we are not just national, we are planetary. I mean, reading Lester Brown on the food crisis, for instance, you clearly realize, you look at the demography, that the world is actually ready for another redistribution of population. I mean, or it will need another redistribution of population. And if you stick to national politics of racism, xenophobia, the Ghuspetias and all that, then you will not see this problem. So I actually think that there's an emergent need for transnational governance bodies, and they don't have to be completely post-national. The nation states don't have to be scrapped, but politicians have to come to this realization that certain planetary problems are emerging, which will in the end kill us all if we don't deal with them. And I would put that question to, since we are privileged enough to have Dr. Ramesh amongst us, I'm trying to answer in some respects both Nagasridhar's question as to what opportunities are there for environmental history, your observation as to whether or not this is kind of the official death of environmental history, or there are other opportunities, as well as raising a question that, in fact, among us, Dr. Ramesh may be in the best position to answer from having experienced those negotiations. I only sometimes have private conversations with Navroz Dubash, who is a good friend, on these questions.
Our next question is also for Professor Chakrabarty, and it is, sir, is it safe to argue that the industrial age brought about the Anthropocene, or will the age of nuclear production have more weightage regarding the question of geological agents?
Okay, so here, it's very important to understand that the Anthropocene description is not a settled one. Geologists haven't formalized it yet. What is very clear when you read books on Anthropocene, when you read the materials amassed by the working group on the Anthropocene, is the human impact on the planet. So there are geologists who propose that the term should remain informal, like snowball Earth and hothouse Earth. There are geologists who argue that we should keep it informal and talk about ancient, medieval, or ancient, middle, and modern Anthropocene. And they want to argue that these people want to argue that the Anthropocene begins with the invention of fire by hominins, because that's when you had a biological species which had at its disposal more energy than its muscles could provide. Scholars in Princeton for a long time Ruddiman and others have argued that the Anthropocene should be dated from the beginning of agriculture. Then Mark Maslin and Simon Lewis have argued that it should be dated from the 1600s, the colonization of Latin America. So there are many proposals on the board. So I think, that's why I come back to that however you define it, it brings up and brings back to us the question of the planetary. It goes beyond the normal tools with which we'll describe capitalism or globalization. So what I might say to our anonymous questioner is that when the term was proposed by Paul Crutzen, he actually proposed that it should be dated from 1750, from the Industrial Revolution on. So, but the current, the working group that is actually putting forward the proposal to the International Union of Geologists for formalization of the term are proposing that we date it from the 1950s, which includes the nuclear fallouts as a signature, as a global signature of the Anthropocene. How this will play out among geologists, I don't know. I'm sure there'll be also, if it becomes an official term, it will have impact. So there'll be lobbying. I'm sure interest groups will lobby. It may remain an informal term that everybody uses. So I think its cultural future is assured, as Dalaswitz says, but its formalization question is not definitely guaranteed. But the data they've unearthed about the human impact on the planet, what will remain as traces of human existence once in the strata of the planet, that data is more or less irrefutable, whether or not the term gets formalized. So yes, so the dating itself, I'll say to my questioner friends, has been debated by many, and it's not a settled point. But I would say the bulk of the agreement among people concerned who are going to try to formalize it is to date it from the 1950s. I think modern historians would agree. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, sorry
Jyotika.
for interrupting, sir.
No problem.
Our next question is from Siddharth Mukherjee. What would the politics of saving the planet mean for the marginalized in the third world, whose history of energy use does not go back very far in time?
Well, it's I don't know what is the politics of saving the planet. I have not outlined any such politics. In fact, what I'm saying is it's very difficult to create one set of politics that will save the planet. And I think, as Rohan was saying, I mean, the debate between eco-modernists who want to save the planet, but on human terms, on terms of human domination of the planet. And they have plans for geoengineering. The Gates Foundation has given a lot of money to Harvard historical physicist David Keith. That's one way to save the planet. At the same time, if you read Edward Wilson, again, another Harvard great biologist, his book called Half Earth, you will see that he's actually arguing that we should try and leave half of the land surface of the Earth to other species. That is, withdraw, don't expand. But he has a very practical proposition. I mean, apart from this utopian sounding proposition, he actually says, if we could return all the national parks of the world, and there are, I forget that, there are about 150 or thereabouts, the figure is there, national parks, to their pristine ecology. That is, before interference made for invasive, not just invasive species to come in, but before human interference took out the capstone species, which could have been even a tree or a plant or an animal from and disturbing the ecology of this park. So one proposition he has is to return all the national parks back to their pristine ecology as one way to kind of grow more biodiversity hotspots. So these are all proposals, and some of them are quite actionable if people would agree. My own sense is that because we are a technology-based civilization and technology is not going away, it will be part of how we solve or how we try to solve. There's not just one consistent set of options, and that's why there are debates. There are different interest groups. Even in geoengineering, there are debates about what kind of geoengineering will actually benefit the Americans. And there's certain kind of geoengineering that's easily done with American war weapons, basically. They're the armaments they have for, and that'll kind of continue a sort of an era of American domination. And there are other kinds of geoengineering that people are discussing. A lot of this actually goes back to the question that Tanika and Shahid were also raising. What kind of politics? And my point in the book, if I may say, in the middle, before answering another question, is my understanding is to say, and this is what I keep saying to Latour, who's a very good personal friend, but also to people like Donna Haraway and who I respect, but who's not a personal friend, or others who are writing about the post-human, is that these thinkers are often giving us an idea about where we want to be. But how we get there is not necessarily clear. And so there's a huge amount of uncertainty about how to get there. These are all, sometimes I describe them respectfully and with praise as the Thomas Moores of our age who are writing new utopias. And those utopias are actually telling us what we should be like. But at the same time, I give enough instances in the book to say, something like Philip Pettit doesn't know. Steve van der Heyden, who works on atmospheric justice, doesn't know. And the other interesting problem is that it's very difficult to extend human terms to non-humans. It's not always easy. So in the book, I discuss the question of whether monkeys, like monkeys in Delhi, should actually be displaced animals should be called refugees, according to the official definition of the word refugee, and be given some privileges. But think of the pandemic and think of our knowledge of bacteria and viruses. If bacteria and viruses were human beings, I'm sure we would call this knowledge colonial knowledge. It's knowledge whose aim is to dominate. But what do you do with a virus that is now killing you? I mean, you want to dominate it. What else can you do? So there are these profoundly ethical questions. Actually, I mean, we don't have time. I mean, there's a question of, that's why I go back to this question of the human, like they're profound ethical questions. Do we value all the human lives that we are now able to sustain because of technology? So if you look at human history, it took us almost 300,000 years to get to 1 billion. And then it went boom. And I find Gandhi tremendously interesting in many instances, where you'd find Gandhi taking care of the sick and the dying, but not believing in technology that would prolong life. I mean, Gandhi would sometimes, these are very ethical questions. The Franciscans did that. Mother Teresa used to do that. It's not like humans haven't thought about these things in ethical terms. But we're not, that's not the Pandora's box we're opening today. But that's why I'm saying that to both Shahid and Tanika, that while we cannot not be interested in politics and in human equity and welfare and all of those things, and while we cannot not be interested in the question of non-human, how to connect them together not in a historical narrative, but within a justice narrative, within an equity narrative, it's still extremely hard because humans have not had to think about this question in a different way, except with indigenous societies, but indigenous societies supported small numbers of the population. So if you value human life and going forward, you think that you want 10 billion human beings to be sustained, to think otherwise is to actually condemn the poor to death. Because if you don't care about human life, effectively you don't care about the poor, because they're the most vulnerable. So there are deep, that's where what I'm trying to do in the book is to explore a predicament. And I often think that unless you explore a predicament to its depths, you come up with solutions that are too easy.
I think we have time for one last question. I'm so sorry if we couldn't get to other people's questions. We are on a little bit of a time crunch today.
Yeah.
So the last question is from Professor Chinmay Guha. He says, you begin with the words of Spinoza, which gives us in a way the philosophical essence of the book. Do you think Spinoza's work, God or Nature, is immensely important?
Chinmay is a very good friend. So thank you, Chinmay, for being there. And for those of you who don't know Chinmay, he's a professor of English literature at Calcutta University. But a very gifted man and a very good scholar of French, also translator of the correspondence between Romarola and Tagore. Very gifted man and a very good poet, I discovered recently. But Chinmay, yes, I end the book talking about the question of reverence because a geologist friend, Andrew Glikson, said in passing in his book that having forgotten a sense of reverence for the planet, humans, blah blah blah. And I thought when a geologist uses a word like reverence, he's actually closer to theology than geology. And I take up the question of reverence with respect and awe, and I kind of return to theological questions, not via Spinoza in the last chapter, more via Rudolf Otto, the German theologian who actually discusses this category of mysterium tremendum, which is also incidentally discussed by Derrida in his books in the Gift of, I think the Gift of Death book on mourning and things. So yes, I think Spinoza's pantheism, Spinoza is extremely helpful because it's in many respects when these ethical questions come up. I mean, there are resources in Buddhism and other sources that I know less about, but some people have detected, and probably not wrongly, altogether wrongly, because I've been influenced, though my knowledge of this area is not very deep, and I'm trying to know this better, by Stoicism. And Stoicism is a running theme in a lot of these questions in European philosophy. And because climate change means facing loss. Climate change means grieving. We're already grieving the people who will be lost in the pandemic. I mean, don't forget that the pandemic is part of the family of problems we call climate change, or planetary problems. So, how to deal with loss? How to live facing maybe major civilizational devastation? How to prepare oneself for those things? This is where. Among others, Spinoza is extremely helpful. And actually, there's one reference that to Spinoza that comes back in the book, Chinmay, you'll have noticed, is by Althusser's Spinozism. I have a few references to certain sections of ethics. But thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarty, for answering the questions. I now request our chair, Dr. Ramesh, to sum up this evening's event. And after that, we'll end the night with a vote of thanks by Mr. Verma.
Very difficult to sum up almost 2 hours of very wide-ranging and enriching discussions. I'll just make a couple of observations. First of all, I find Professor Chakrabarty making far greater references to Tagore than to Gandhi in his book. I hope that does not represent a triumph of ethnicity over
No.
over reality. But I'm so glad that he brought out Tagore in his book, because a few months before she died, our Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had gone to Shantiniketan, and she reminisced about her time, the 1 year that she spent in Shantiniketan. And she called Tagore the ecological man. She didn't call Gandhi ecological man. She called Tagore ecological man. And there's much to glean for the current predicament from Tagore. We all know, of course, of Gandhi, but far less known is the thinking of Tagore when it comes to the issues that concern us today. Secondly, I just say that over the last couple of years, uh, scientists have put forward the idea of what are called planetary boundaries. And global warming is one of the 9 planetary boundaries. We have loss of biodiversity, we have the ozone layer, we have the nitrogen cycle, we have the acidification of the ocean. So what scientists from Stockholm, the Stockholm Resilience Center, came up with this concept of planetary boundaries. And in some of these boundaries, we have crossed the boundaries to our detriment. In some of the boundaries, we are still within, within safe limits. And some, of course, we do not yet measure. Now, the ozone layer is a good example of a planetary boundary, which we have actually grappled with very successfully. And Professor Chakrabarty has mentioned the Montreal Protocol. The Montreal Protocol remains the one successful multilateral international environmental agreement, although what was the solution to the problem of the ozone layer, which was the substitution of the hydrochlorofluorocarbons by the hydrofluorocarbons, has now become the problem, because we are now trying to figure out how to substitute for the hydrofluorocarbons, which once upon a time was seen to be
Exactly.
solution. So very important to understand that in these issues that we are grappling with, today's solution may end up becoming tomorrow's problem. And the
Absolutely.
HFC on the ozone layer is a very good example of this. But I think what the reason why I brought out this concept of planetary boundaries, because Professor Chakrabarty deals with one of the most, of course, the most frequently talked about planetary boundary, which is global warming, and the impact it has on climate change. But there are different dimensions to this, and I think when we discuss the implications of Professor Chakrabarty's book, we have to look at these different dimensions of planetary boundaries. Global warming is one. Thirdly, and perhaps finally, I'd say is that broadly speaking, we have two solutions to the problems and the dilemmas that Professor Chakrabarty highlights so eloquently in his book. One is the Bill Gates' approach. The Bill Gates' approach is a techno-fix approach. Everything can be solved by technology. Just give us time, unleash the forces of innovation, and we'll be able to solve this problem of transgressing of planetary boundaries. This is the Gates approach. There's also the William Nordhaus approach. William Nordhaus is the who got the Nobel Prize for economics. He got it for environmental economics, perhaps the most distinguished environmental economist of generation. And the Nordhaus approach is, you have a carbon tax. I mean, let the price of carbon reflect the damage that carbon is doing, in the atmosphere, and that will create the incentive structure for technologies to emerge. So we have the Bill Gates approach, or we have the William Nordhaus approach. But I think what Professor Chakrabarty is mentioning in his book, and which has come out in the discussion today, that beyond economics and beyond technology, lie questions of ethics, lie questions related to consumption, lie ultimately questions related to politics, both domestic politics and international politics. these discussions, the solutions that we need to solve the types of conundrums that Professor Chakrabarty raises has to be embedded in a framework of domestic politics and has to be embedded in a system of international politics in which, unfortunately, nation states are of paramount importance. I say unfortunately because nation states, as Professor Chakrabarty has pointed out, very often end up being part of the problem and not part of the solution. For example, we very well know that the environmental challenges that South Asia faces has to transcend the nation state thinking, whether it is on rivers, whether it's on mountains, whether it's on glaciers. But we are finding it very difficult to transcend the nation state barrier. So we have to understand that there are ethical dimensions, there are consumption issues of which Gandhi has written about and talked about very extensively, and ultimately there are the political issues, issues of domestic political economy and international political economy. And I think some of these issues really Professor Chakrabarty has mentioned in his book. He's talked about the population problem, for example. He's talked about the consumption issue. Um, Ram Guha has a wonderful book. How much do we consume? How much should we consume? I mean, its consumption is very much part of the problem. Remember that between 1992 and 2010, the population of China was either stagnant or was showing a marginal decline, but the consumption of China went up sixfold. So with the net result being China is today a much larger emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, than it was, say, in the 1990s. Even though its population was flat, consumption skyrocketed. So consumption really is at the heart of the issue. And one of the questions that was raised, of Professor Chakrabarty, addressed the ethical dimensions of this consumption, because there are very large populations in Africa, certainly very large populations in South Asia, certainly a very large population in India, which does not have the standard of living, which you and I and participants in today's discussion have. And it would be ethically unwise. In fact, it would be completely ethically wrong to say that consumption for us means one thing, and consumption for those people who do not have it means something else. Many years ago, there was a very distinguished civil servant called S. Bhutulingam, who once, while he was reviewing a book by an economist, described wage goods as goods that economists would like wage earners to buy, but which they themselves would not want to buy. So, there is this whole ethical dimension, in the discussion. So, we can go on. We've had a long discussion. We've had 4 very distinguished academics, look at Professor Chakrabarty's book from different points of view. I hope that with the publication of this book, some debate, some discussion will be generated, not just in academic circles, but also in the media, and also, in the policy world. So thank you, Professor Chakrabarty, for this really outstanding piece of work, which brings in science, which brings in politics, which brings in history, because history is really at the heart. When I was environment minister, all our discussions was on history. Who was responsible for global warming? In fact, the phrase historical responsibility is integral to all these discussions that we have. So I'm so glad that a historian with a scientific background has really given us this great piece of work. And I'm delighted to meet Professor Shahid Amin. I'm a great student of his. We've all been great. Professor Chakrabarty, I must end by taking a dig at the subalterns. Both Professor Shahid Amin and Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty, are the founders of the subaltern school, but they are eminently readable. So that's what I really admire in both of them. that they come from a tradition of writing dense, but they themselves have been exceptions to this rule. And the book that we have discussed today and Professor Amin's early works are really classics, not in only their subject, but classics in communication as well. So thank you very much, Varma sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Varma, can I quickly say a few words of thanks on my behalf?
Yes, please. Please.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks to everybody who came, and also to people, friends and others whose questions we didn't have time to answer. But I thank them for the questions and ask for their forgiveness for not being able to answer them. I also want to say that, and this I say genuinely, because I always feel that praise speaks of the person who praises. It doesn't speak of the person being praised. And so you can only be humbled by praise. And when it comes from such distinguished people, very, very treasured friends, a new friend like Rohan. So I'm very humbled by the praise. And I mean that absolutely genuinely. I also want to say this is one of the most significant discussions that of the book that I've had so far. And I've had many. But I would say of the few that I'll remember, this will definitely be one. So I'm very grateful to all of you for your responses, for what you said, and to those who attended, and of course to Bolaji for his interest in the book and for giving us this opportunity to come together. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Jyotika.
I now invite Mr. Verma to wrap up this evening and give the vote of thanks.
I'll just take a few minutes, my friend. Good evening, audience, and thank you for having found time to be with us today. I hope you found the discussions on Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty's latest book exciting enough to want to read it. I particularly want to thank our chief guest, Dr. Jairam Ramesh, for launching the book on a subject that is so close to his heart. I must say, I was totally disarmed when within minutes of my writing to him, I got an enthusiastic reply accepting this invitation. This shows his commitment to any effort that draws our attention to how human interventions have affected nature. And this is not surprising, considering that he himself has written a book on the environment. So thank you very much, sir, for having released this book, Climate of History in a Planetary Age. Professor Tanika Sarkar is with us because of a deep commitment to issues like and social justice. How committed she is to her principles is clear from the fact that she returned the Rabindra Purashkar, the highest literary award given by the West Bengal government, on ideological grounds. Professor Sarkar, incidentally, is also known for her wonderful collection of miniature birds in terracotta, ceramic, porcelain, etc. Thank you, Professor Sarkar, for sharing your thoughts with us on the merits of this book. Rohan, to you I owe a special thanks for staying up so late in the night to participate in this discussion. Your presentation came through with such lucidity, perhaps because of your association with late Richard Grove, author of that iconic book, Green Imperialism. And there's another facet of your personality that JNU faculty members and students fondly recall. The days when, as the General Secretary of the JNU Students' Union, you would take up cudgels on behalf of the students. No one can take JNU out of you, Rohan, since we hear that even in distant Kyoto, you have laid out red sandstone tiles on the pathway of your house. I am thankful to Professor Rita Brara for her wonderful presentation on Professor Chakrabarty's book. Your concern and focus, ma'am, on environment and climate change comes through clearly in your presentation. I hope that you will find this book useful for the courses on environment and climate change that you are offering to your students. And now on to Professors Shahid Amin and Dipesh Chakrabarty. Shahid, to you first. Your Chori Chora book is perhaps one of the best alternative histories ever written. You and Muzaffar Sahab were the two to alert me that Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty was on to something really big. Thank you, Shahid, for this and for introducing both the book and the author today. And Muzaffar Sahab, grateful thanks for connecting me with Professor Chakrabarty at the Quad. Finally, I wish to express my deep gratitude to Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty for giving us the opportunity to publish The Climate of History. You have supported us through thick and thin and helped us to make this book possible. You supported Primus when it came to the choice of publisher for the South Asian territory. And you also supported us strongly in our fight against the whimsical attitude of Amazon India. Everyone is familiar with the course you have charted in your academic career, from physics to management studies to history. But not many people know of your role in a children's theater group and your singing ability. Your versatility is simply astounding. And before I close, I would like to thank the managing director of Primus Books, who has provided us with the financial support required to keep publishing even in the fallow years that we have lived through. University libraries have been closed and are making no purchases. Our revenues are at their lowest, and yet our publishing program has not suffered. This requires great vision, strong grit, and deep commitment. And I salute Mr. Sugat Jain for having such tenacity and confidence in Primus. I would like to thank my editorial and marketing teams, in particular, Sean Mitra, Jyotika, and the latest to join us, Prasoon, who have all worked so hard to make today's program a success. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, viewers and every member of the audience for making this evening's program so meaningful. Goodbye and good night. Have a pleasant weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
And yeah,
Bye-bye.
stay well.
Bye.
Thanks.
Just a minute. I can't hear you. You unmute yourself. You unmute yourself.
Sean is muted, so I don't know why we
He
can't
is
hear him.
unmuted.
He is unmuted.
Yeah, you can't hear him. You have to increase the volume, Sean Mitra, of your computer.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
him now.
yes.
Tell me. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you very much once again. The three
Sorry,
of you.
just 1 second. Just 1 second. Just 1 second. I need to put off the recording. You're done with it.